Welcome to the Dog's Way Podcast, episode 73. In today's podcast, we get a little geeky. This is part one of two. In part one, I give you a background on conditioning. We talk about B.F. Skinner, talk about Skinner's 4 quadrants, and by the end of this episode, you'll be able to figure out what kind of techniques fit into which quadrants. In part two of this, in podcast 74, we'll talk about application of techniques and some mistakes within those quadrants. I'll be right back.
Welcome to the Dog's Way Podcast, where we solve dog problems by training people. Because, let's face it, your dog couldn't possibly download this podcast on their own. And now your host, here he is, Sean McDaniel.
Thank you, John Melly, for that introduction, and welcome to the Dog's Way Podcast, episode 73. And in this episode, this is kind of a part one of a two-part, I don't know what we'll call this. I guess we'll call it kind of a mini course on conditioning and B.F. Skinner and Skinner's 4 quadrants, and then kind of the application of that stuff in the part two of this in the next podcast, in podcast 74. And so a lot of info in this. There was just way too much information to kind of pack it into one podcast, and thought I'd give you guys a brain break and a breather between all of the info. So we've got kind of a part one, part two. Never done that before, but hopefully it'll mesh together well for you guys. Before we jump into that, though, I wanted to thank Pup Dog Rescue for sponsoring this episode of the Dog's Way Podcast. And the Pup Dog Rescue highlighted dog for this episode is Sadie. And Sadie is available through Pup Dog Rescue. She's a Dachshund mix. She's 5 years old and she's about 18 pounds right now. Looked really cute, kind of a wire-haired Dachshund mix, looks like. And her foster family says she's really energetic, really friendly, and but she also knows how to settle down when it's bedtime. So sounds like a pretty good review there for Sadie. And we'll have a link to her page in our show notes, or you could go to pupdogrescue.org if you want more information about Sadie or any of the other dogs they have available. So thanks to Pup Dog Rescue for sponsoring this episode of the Dog's Way Podcast. And actually, I do have another little shout out and kind of the housekeeping here before we jump into information. I wanted to really thank Brian DeBose with On Web Partners. As you guys know, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, we've had a whole bunch of technical difficulties in the last several months. And Brian is, as far as I know, he's kind of a podcast magician. He kind of got under the hood and looked at what we were doing sort of in the background there on the technical side of things. And I think he actually said that he was surprised we were getting any podcasts out with the way our technical setup was. So he went in and kind of fixed all that and got us back on the straight and narrow. And as a result of that, we're actually available on a whole bunch of other podcast platforms now too. You can listen to us on your Amazon Alexa or your Google Home. You can listen to us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn. And so we're on a bunch more platforms now for you to listen to. I actually had a listener send me an email just last week saying that she was excited that she could just say, Alexa, play the Dog's Way Podcast. And all of a sudden, guess what? The Dog's Way Podcast is playing there. There's a little drawback on that Amazon Alexa. I'm not sure if it works this way for the Google Home, but it'll play the most recent podcast. And I think you can ask for the previous one, but I think that's kind of it. You can't really ask for a specific episode, which actually brings up another little kind of sidebar housekeeping suggestion that I had from several listeners is that they'd been listening for a while, and then they told me, kind of unrelated to each other, that they discovered that there's a whole bunch of kind of educational podcasts in the early podcasts, and they sort of figured that out by accident. So if you're a new podcast listener, this podcast is set up a little bit differently. I know if you're kind of used to listening to political podcast or a sports podcast, it's all kind of about current events. Nobody cares what, 20 podcasts ago, what that information is all about, because it's so 10 minutes ago. It's not really the opinions about current events. That's not really the way this podcast is put together if you're a new podcast listener. So the suggestion I would have is go back through one of those other platforms, if it's iTunes or Spotify or the podcast page at thedogsway.com, and go back and listen. If you have an adult dog that's over 7 months old, listen to episodes 2, 3, and 4, and that'll kind of get you going in a foundational setup for our kind of training philosophy, some of our early relationship exercises to kind of get your dog tuned back up again. If you have a puppy under 6.5 months old, you want to start, I think, at podcast number 4. So 4, 5, and 6 will kind of get you going. And then there's a whole bunch of other podcasts in there too. I interviewed someone from Guide guide dogs for the blind and pet partners, giving you kind of an outline of how to become a therapy dog team with your dog, and a lot of cool interviews with some search and rescue folks and with King County Search and Rescue, and lots of great interviews. So there was a lot of suggestions that I should probably highlight that for you guys. If you're new to the podcast, it's not really like a lot of the popular podcasts out there that are just kind of riffing about current events. And there's lots of information in the earlier episodes. So there you go. That's the housekeeping stuff. And thanks again to Pup Dog Rescue and to Brian DeBose from OnWeb Partners. So all that being said, let's jump into some of the info for today. And by the way, the reason that why I'm doing this is there's been a bunch of emails that came in asking, because I'm referring to Skinner's Four Quadrants periodically when talking to other trainers. And I've got a bunch of emails in asking, like, what are you talking about? Or asking for clarification on some things, or just for some more information as kind of a primer so that people don't feel kind of lost if I'm talking to another trainer and I'm referencing something. So this will be kind of like, I guess, sort of a big email bag. So I pulled out a couple of emails that were asking about more info on Skinner's Four Quadrants, and we'll check out those emails and then we'll jump into the info. So without further ado, let's check out the two emails I pulled out of the stack. Hi, Sean. Love your show. It's one of the few podcasts that I follow. Well, thanks. I just listened to your interview with Eric, and you mentioned Skinner's Four Quadrants. I've heard of these before, but I'd love more information on them. Please give us some background if you would. You mention them every once in a while, and I looked them up, but I'm totally confused by the articles I'm reading, and many of them aren't specific to dog training. Thanks, Emily, Edinburgh, Scotland. Well, thanks, Emily, for taking the time to send that in. And love Edinburgh. I was in Edinburgh about a year and a half ago, and man, it was great. You guys could do with a little more sun, but but besides that, I loved Edinburgh. I loved the people, loved the place, loved the history, loved the pubs. The pubs, you could just hang out with your dogs in there, and it was kind of cool just seeing dogs and really well-behaved dogs too. If you're a dog trainer in Edinburgh, let me know, because as I was walking around Edinburgh, I was there for a couple of weeks, and I often thought that it was a bad place for dog trainers because all the dogs seemed very well behaved. But I love Edinburgh, Emily, and thanks for sending that in. And the next email is from Los Angeles. And Sylvia writes, Dear Mr. McDaniel, our family loves your podcast. It has helped us understand our two dogs so much more completely. I'm a grad student in psychology, and my husband works in a counseling-related field as well. We feel like we have a very good grasp of behavioral modification, but somehow couldn't apply it well for our dogs. So thanks for the clarification of how to make the ideas manifest for us in our training of our dogs. I hear you touch on Skinner's Four Quadrants periodically in your discussion with other trainers. My question is about Skinner's work as it relates to dog training. Is modern dog training based on Skinner's work? If so, I would love some examples of the various techniques used in dog training vis-a-vis the Four Quadrants framework. I think it may be a good topic for a podcast. Thanks for your consideration of our ideas and for all of the information you provide. Best regards, Sylvia, Los Angeles, California. I think it would be a great idea for a podcast too, Sylvia. I agree. So, hey, let's do one. So those are our emails, and I thought I would get back to Sylvia and Emily via the podcast, and obviously just the other people. I apologize. I couldn't, I don't want to read emails all day, but I getting back to all the other questions from the other emails as well, asking for a little bit more knowledge, information, background on Skinner's Four Quadrants. However, stuff didn't start with Skinner. So I wanted to give you just a few minutes of history of what Skinner was kind of basing his stuff on, and then we'll jump into the Four Quadrants. So here's the really quick kind of abridged history of some conditioning stuff. Strangely, the first guy I'll throw at you is not a psychologist. He was a Russian physiology and kind of medical researcher, and kind of circa late 1800s, very early 1900s. I think he was born around 1850-ish, somewhere in there. You probably remember Pavlov's dog. He really solidified what's called classical conditioning. It's a pretty simple form of conditioning, and it's just that conditioning that happens when something that's normally kind of neutral, in other words, doesn't have any meaning or effect on you or a dog, is paired in space and time with something that does have meaning or affects your behavior in some way. And that's the classic Pavlov's dog with the bell, right? He was actually a research physiologist, and he was doing research on salivary glands. And he noticed that when he fed the dogs, he walked in one time without the food and the dogs were still salivating. So he ended up constructing his now famous experiment of ringing the bell as he fed the dogs. And pretty soon All you had to do was ring the bell and the dog salivated. Kind of that reflexive response to what normally was a non-food related neutral stimulus. And that's the reason that's good to know about, is that happens all the time. Sometimes it happens accidentally and we don't know about it. And why is my dog acting like that? Like if you pick up your keys and your coat and your leash, your dog does something. That's usually conditioned classically, right? You notice that when you have a squeaky hinge on your food cabinet. You go to open the cabinet where the food is, where you keep the dog food, and all of a sudden you have like 3 dogs at your feet and you haven't gotten the food out yet. But that squeaky hinge indicates that means food's coming. So they react to that because it's a paired stimulus. It's happened so often in conjunction with one another that hinge sound or that door creaking sound has the effect on your dog. So that classical conditioning is kind of important. And it actually is the way that we would, in operant conditioning, when you have a bridging signal or a marker of behavior and some kind of reinforcing reward, that's actually how you would condition that classically. You would, if you're a dolphin trainer, you'd blow a whistle, give a dolphin a fish, blow a whistle, give a dolphin a fish, blow a whistle, give a dolphin a fish. And it creates that feeling. You see this when you do this with puppy training, where you say, I use what I call a verbal marker. I say good and give a puppy a treat. Say good and give a puppy a treat. That's the first 10 treats that a puppy gets, as I say good before each treat. And pretty soon you go good, and the puppy's tail starts to wag. They look all excited, like, I don't know why I like that word. That's a pretty cool word now. And so that pairing of the seemingly neutral thing with something that has inherent value to it or that affects the dog is a classical conditioning that largely comes from Pavlov's work. So to be clear about classical conditioning, the idea of classical conditioning in Pavlov's sort of experiments, there's a big distinction in classical conditioning versus, say, operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is kind of a learning of a behavior. Classical conditioning is not considered kind of a quote unquote learned behavior. It's sort of a reflexive response, like salivation. Like you don't decide to salivate. And so when I'm talking about a classically conditioned response to like the squeaky door hinge where the dog food's kept, or you picking up your keys and your dog reacting in a certain way, or you classically conditioning your dog's excitement to the sound of a clicker or a buzzer or a verbal marker word like good or yes, it's not the behavior. It's not the dog learned to sit when the squeaky cabinet opened, or it's not your dog knocking over lamps because you picked up your car keys. It's not that behavior. Technically, it's kind of the step before that. So it's literally just the physiological excitement that happens in response to something that was before this pairing happened, before this kind of association in time happened, was just a neutral stimulus. Jingling car keys. If a dog's never been out the door when car keys jingle or been on a car ride or gone to the park, those are just neutral sounds. And so you pair that enough with some expectation or result that causes physiological excitement. Pretty soon you can get that physiological excitement by jingling car keys or picking up a leash or clicking a clicker or saying the word good. And then you get that excited response from your dog. Then you can use that to actually teach a learned behavior. Moving on kind of about one generation down the timeline, John Watson was a behavioral researcher, kind of World War I era psychology researcher. About 10, 15 years after Pavlov, he was in the United States. He didn't work with animals. He worked with humans, but he worked with a lot of the classical kinds of conditioning that Pavlov discovered with his dogs and salivation. And Watson's kind of a funny character because he's, I think, a really brilliant guy, but he also is a bit quirky. And did some experiments that probably wouldn't be allowed today. He famously or infamously did this, what was called the Little Albert experiment, where he took a little human infant and exposed him to a white fluffy animal. I think it was a rat. And little Albert wasn't scared of that animal at all. But Watson's contention was through conditioning, he could make him afraid of the animal. So you would expose little Albert to this white fluffy rabbit, and he would have an assistant, or he would sneak up behind little Albert and clang cymbals and startle him and scare him. And so little Albert would have this startling, scary experience while looking at the little white fluffy animal. And pretty soon he could present the white rat in front of little Albert, and he would just start crying because of the association he had built up. So obviously pretty unethical experiment, torturing a little kid for science. But subsequent work kind of led to some slightly more ethical behavior. That was around, I think he published that in like 1920 or so. And a few years later, he was actually giving a lecture, and somebody in the audience was really interested in the little Albert experiment. And she actually conducted research in a very similar vein, but she kind of flipped the script. Mary Cover Jones did some research that was very much like the little Albert experiment, except with little Peter. And she did the reverse kind of experiment. She found a little kid that was kind of inherently afraid, or at least presented as afraid of the white lab rat. And through the reverse process, where she would have the rat off in a cage kind of at a distance, and little Peter would see the rat and not really react too much, but then she'd give little Peter his favorite food. I think it was like his favorite ice cream or something like that. And eventually they would increase the proximity of the white rat while Peter was eating the ice cream. And they'd go incrementally like that until pretty soon those good feelings of the ice cream sort of overrode the bad feelings of the white rat, or the reaction to the white rat. And so, as you can probably guess, that's where we got a lot of desensitization and specifically counter-conditioning type procedures from Mary Cover Jones' advancement of Watson's work. And I'm not sure whether that lecture was while Watson was still researching, because he actually had a fairly short academic career, because his ethical failings weren't limited to torturing little kids. I think he had an extramarital affair, and they fired him from his job at, I think it was Johns Hopkins. But then he went into marketing and started conditioning people to buy commercial products. But Cover Jones and Watson's work was really kind of in that like associative reaction kind of research, a little bit more classical-ish kind of conditioning. And it wasn't really about learning a behavior or problem solving. And so the next set of researchers kind of started to build on this idea and worked into more problem solving / learning kinds of setup experiments. And then the next big kind of jumping off point, a contemporary, little bit slightly later, but contemporary kind of same time period as Watson, was Edward Thorndike. So Thorndike was a researcher that he did work with animals. He's famous for the cat puzzle box experiments, where he would put a cat in a box. There was a lever on the inside of the box. The cat could get out of the box if it learned to press the lever, and they'd put a little piece of fish or food on the outside of the box, and the cat was motivated. Hungry cat, there's food outside the box, and man, I'd love to get out there. And so the cat would experiment and try to push the gate open and try to do all kinds of stuff, and randomly would step on this lever, open the door, get the fish. Then Thorndike and his staff would put the cat right back in the box again. And guess what? It took less time for the cat to press the lever to get out of the box to get the fish. And you could see that each subsequent trial, it just took less and less and less time. The cat learned or repeated the behavior pressing the lever that resulted in the escape and the getting of the food. And so Thorndike's work was probably best summarized in his he developed what he called 3 laws of learning: the law of readiness, the law of exercise, and the law of effect. Pretty simple laws. The law of readiness is just that I think the way it's phrased now is if a child is ready to learn, then the connection to learning is positive. In other words, if they really want to learn, then they're going to think learning is a good thing. If they're not ready to learn, then the connection to learning is negative. The law of exercise is pretty straightforward too. It's just that through repetition and practice, a skill is strengthened. When practice is discontinued, the skill is weakened. And then the law of effect is really what the jumping off point was for Skinner, who sort of expanded on the law of effect that simply said rewarded behaviors become more frequent and behaviors that result in negative responses become less frequent. And so Thorndike's work was kind of expanded on by Skinner. So congratulations, you made it all the way to Skinner. So Skinner was, like a lot of people in history, like John Watson, was, I think, quite a brilliant guy and a little bit quirky. He was really, I think, elegantly experimented with animals in kind of that comparative psychology way, where you experiment with animals and then you can kind of extrapolate to here's how humans learn too, in comparing how animals learn to how humans learn. And so through his experiments, kind of like Thorndike's cat puzzle box experiments, Skinner made a box also, a Skinner box. And so he was a little smarter with the marketing. He branded it his own thing, the Skinner box. So it's kind of a box. The goal wasn't the same thing, though. In Thorndike's cat puzzle box experiment, the goal of the animal was, how do I get out of this box to get to where the one food reward is? In Skinner's box, it was a big box that has a plexiglass front so you could see the behaviors. And it was designed to repeatedly reinforce some behavior. And so if you wanted a pigeon to peck on a target, or you wanted a rat to go through a certain door, or step on a certain paddle, or step on a certain ladder, or something like that, you would just wait randomly until the rat did the thing you wanted to do, or the pigeon did the thing you wanted to do, and you'd press the button. And as soon as they did that thing, the buzzer would sound and a food pellet would drop into the cup. And then it might take a little less time for that behavior to happen again, and you would press the button, buzzer would sound, food pellet would drop in the cup. And pretty soon the rat or the pigeon would start going, I don't know why, but I'm digging pecking on this target, or I'm digging pressing this paddle because it's getting me food. And in Skinner's protocols too, by the way, you kept the pigeons and rats you were doing an experiment with at about 80% of their normal body weight. So you kept them very hungry on a regular feeding schedule, but a very minimal feeding schedule, so that they and you would do the experiment right at the feeding time, at the normal feeding time. So it's like, hey, it's time to eat. So you created motivation that way, and you kept a really hungry animal so that food was a consistent motivation. So one of the cool things he kind of developed as he started refining this conditioning process more was that it wasn't just kind of a simple behavior where, animal does thing one and you reward it. Great, we've got a conditioned behavior. Animal does thing one. What he realized is you could start rewarding progressive approximations of a behavior to take an animal through a full scope of behavior. Famously, you can kind of look it up on YouTube. There's a kind of the famous pigeon experiment where you teach a pigeon to turn in a circle. The pigeon looks to their left and you mark and reinforce that. Pigeon looks to the left again, you mark and reinforce that. And they go, well, I don't know why. I guess turn left, get food. Got it. And then once that behavior gets conditioned to looking left, then you don't reward that level of the behavior. You wait for a little bit more, a further look to the left, and then you reward that. And then you reward progressive approximations of the full circle. And eventually, through repetition and incremental adaptation, you can condition a pigeon to turn all the way to the left in a circle. And then you would label that, and based on the cue, the pigeon would turn around in a circle, boom, they'd get the reward. And that could be applied to people too. There's another kind of famous version of that where they had a developmentally challenged little girl, and she couldn't support herself on her feet. She couldn't stand up or walk. And so they had two chairs back to back, and they had her supporting herself between the chairs and with two people on each chair. And they would give her a little scoop of ice cream. She loved ice cream. And so that was the reinforcing reward. And what they did was they got her to turn back and forth and back and forth. And then they moved the chairs apart by, a couple of inches. And then they just progressively adapted like that until she could walk literally between the chairs. And she needed kind of a handhold rope for kind of a handhold to support her. And then they eventually weaned off of that and she could walk and support herself. So they used that progressive adaptation in rewarding approximations of the behavior to literally teach her to walk. So some pretty cool stuff. So that's the brilliant part of it. The quirky part of it is that Skinner started getting kind of grandiose in his application of conditioning processes. He raised his daughter in sort of the equivalent of a Skinner box. It was a rolling baby crate that looked like a Skinner box. It was an enclosed box that had a plexiglass front on it. He noticed that his wife was just spending a lot of time kind of chasing after the kid. So they just put the kid in the box most of the day, and she was allowed out a couple of times for socialization. And you could control the environment, and they had a roll of towels that you could always have a clean, dry towel on the bottom. And there's video of it. You can look it up. And you could just condition the kid to, if they did something you liked, you'd give them a thing they like. If they didn't do something you like, you just ignore them and you wouldn't give them the thing that they wanted. And so a little bit quirky, but in, I guess, partially his defense, she grew up and wasn't too affected by it psychologically. She grew up to be an artist in London, I think, and did lots of interviews and said, no, I had a happy childhood. It, didn't traumatize me at all. So fits into the gray area of history, probably. Super quirky, didn't seem to have a negative effect, at least in her case. It wasn't very widespread. He tried to sell the baby tender, I think, in like the early 50s or late 50s or somewhere in there. There's old ads you can see in like Ladies' Home Journal or something like that, where the baby tender is the new way to raise your children. And it didn't really take, seemed like. And then he also had kind of political sort of aspirations, not to become a politician, but to sort of regulate how society was run. He kind of thought society should be run by behavioral psychologists, and people should be conditioned properly to do away with all crime and perfect the human being and all that kind of stuff. And he wrote a fictional book called Walden 2 that was not really a sequel, but sort of an offshoot of Thoreau's Walden, kind of an idyllic community where everybody shared things. And it was kind of a utopian fantasy novel in a way. And it's not, he wasn't the first one to do it, Plato's Republic or Thomas More's Utopia. But his was sort of based in behavioral psychology. And so that was his kind of foray into fiction writing, to get that political message out that here's how we should do things. And then he also wrote a how-to book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. It was kind of a how-to. Here's how we should run things. We should take kids away from parents right away. They should be raised by experts who know how to condition them properly. And that's how we can make society better. So that political how-to, a little bit kind of a gray area again, because there was a community that actually was developed specifically motivated by Walden 2 and all Skinner's ideas about how a society and a community should be run. I think it was called Twin Oaks in the late 60s, and it's still running today. There are like 6-7 dozen people there, and I don't think it's the same carryover group. I think people kind of come and go, but yeah, they've lasted. They've had a community that's been running like that. So it had a little bit of that kind of gray area thing again too, where you kind of think like, wow, I don't know if that would really work, but for those folks, I guess it kind of worked. There might be a little bit of a not to wax too much in the political science realm, but it might be good if you have a community like that exists within a thriving, relatively safe Western country. And then you can kind of, there's a big difference between choosing or opting to sort of live your life that way among a whole bunch of cooperative people that are voluntarily deciding to do that, and then deciding to sort of by fiat, this is how you have to live. Might be a little bit of a difference there, but I'll let political science people wade in on that one. And we'll try to stick to psychology today and get into Skinner's behavioral quadrants here. So when you talk about Skinner's 4 quadrants, these are essentially the 4 ways that Skinner thought you could interact with someone or something to affect their behavior, to modify their behavior. They're called quadrants because there's 4 of them. And it's kind of like if you just take a square and you draw like a plus sign down the middle of it, you make 4 quadrants, right? 2 columns and 2 rows, and each of them has a label. Usually how it's shown is that along the top, you've got positive for the first column and negative for the second column. And then on the rows, that first uppermost row, you've got reinforcement, and the second row, you've got punishment. So then you just kind of pair them together, right? The first quadrant on the upper left is positive reinforcement. And then if you go across to the negative column, you've got negative reinforcement. And then the 2 bottom squares in the 2 bottom quadrants are positive punishment and negative punishment. So the first thing to realize in this jargon, positive and negative, reinforcement and punishment, is that the positive and negative terms aren't value judgments. Positive doesn't mean a good thing and negative doesn't mean a bad thing. Positive just means we're adding something, and negative just means we're taking something away. All reinforcement means is we're trying to encourage a behavior to happen more, and punishment means we're trying to discourage a behavior and have it happen less. So you can kind of define things like that. So that quadrant that people are most familiar with, positive reinforcement, is something that where you're adding something positive, like a treat, and it's reinforcement. You're trying to make that behavior happen more. You say sit, your dog sits. You say good and give them a treat. You're adding the treat in response to the behavior that just happened in order to encourage sit to happen more. So let me talk about the second quadrant that I think is probably the most easily understood, and then we'll get to the more confusing ones. So I think negative punishment is the next most understood quadrant. So the definition of punishment is we're trying to discourage a behavior, and negative means we're taking something away. This is what most parents do to discipline kids today, right? That's if you don't clean up your dishes, no Xbox for 3 days. Hey, if you don't pick up the laundry on your floor, no phone for 2 hours. You're trying to discourage leaving dishes out, leaving laundry on the floor of your room. And the way you're doing that is you're taking something away. Negative. So negative punishment is something that you take something away in order to discourage a certain behavior. The classic timeout, right? If you do that again, I'm going to take you away from the group and you can't play with the kids anymore. You see this a lot in dog training, like for barking. If a dog barks, you just take them over to their crate. You put them in their crate in the laundry room. Oh, if you bark like that, we're just going to take you away from the family or the rest of the people or the action, and you just can't interact with that anymore. We're taking away your freedom, or we're taking away your access to people or the other dog or whatever it is. And that's a negative punishment. You're trying to discourage the barking, punishment, and negative, you're taking away the freedom or access to the cool thing. Another form of negative punishment in dog training is that turning your back advice. A dog jumps up on you, so you turn your back and ignore the dog. The behavior you're trying to discourage, punishment, is the jumping up behavior, and you're taking something away, your attention. So that's negative. That's a form of negative punishment. And so in kind of the quote unquote purely positive or modern or scientific dog trainers, I think is the way they describe themselves. Those are kind of the two quadrants that are recommended to be used in that system, right? Positive reinforcement and negative punishment. Just take something away. Just don't let the dog have the toy. Just don't let the dog have the attention. Just don't let the dog have access to whatever as your form of punishment. So positive reinforcement, adding something positive to try to encourage or have a behavior happen more. Negative punishment, taking something away, usually something they like, in order to discourage a certain behavior. So that brings us to the other two. There's another pair, a positive and a negative pair there that can get a little confusing. I think it's just the labels that we use too. Positive punishment is that third quadrant. It just sounds weird, positive punishment. People always kind of like raise an eyebrow and like, what? Positive punishment. And so positive punishment is that correction, right? In dog training, dog jumps up, you pop the leash to the side, pop. Or if you leave dirty dishes on the counter with the kid, you'll have to do all your sister's additional chores today too. Or in the old school parenting, when a kid climbs up on the grocery store shelves when you've told them not to, you give them a swat on the butt. That's what the positive means. You're adding something, the swat on the butt, the pop on the leash, in order to discourage or make a behavior happen less, the jumping or the climbing on the grocery store shelves. So that fourth and last quadrant, negative reinforcement, is another one that just sounds weird because, hey, wait, reinforcement, that's supposed to be a good thing, right? Why am I doing something negative? Well, all negative means in our jargon today is it means you're taking something away. Reinforcement means we're trying to encourage a behavior or have a behavior happen more. This one is probably the most confusing because it doesn't quite fit the definition if you think about it for a second. So I'll give you an example of negative reinforcement. If a kid won't wake up for school at the right time, you this would happen if you're in the military probably, or you're used to it in boot camp. You would run into the room with a metal pot lid and a wooden spoon and start banging it like crazy until your kid got out of bed. Sounds weird, right? The more mild version of that is your alarm clock. Your alarm clock starts beeping, if you're smart about it, on the other side of the room, and it keeps beeping until you get up out of bed, walk across the room and hit the button. Or you get into your car and the buzzer starts going off until you click your seatbelt on. So reinforcement, you're trying to encourage a kid to wake up on time. You're trying to encourage yourself to wake up on time. You're trying to encourage seatbelt use, and you take away some form of unpleasant stimuli. And that unpleasant stimuli stops as soon as you comply with the behavior. So here's the confusing part of this. You've probably already figured it out by now. That in order to take away an unpleasant behavior, in almost all the examples of negative reinforcement, in order to take away the thing, you have to add it in the first place. So that's why that negative reinforcement gets so confusing. There's a version of dog training too, if you're using an e-collar in recall, that when you have a remote training collar, you can hit a button that keeps the static shock going, or you can hit just a little momentary, it's called nick sometimes. And so if you're calling a dog and they don't come to you, you hit that continuous in that technique, and you don't take your thumb off of the button until they start coming to you. So it's kind of like the alarm clock or the buzzer for the seatbelt or something like that. But you could argue definitionally that you're not really taking something away, right? You're adding something and then you're taking it away. So that's why this negative reinforcement does get kind of confusing by Skinner's own definitions of what the word means. By the way, if you are kind of wanting to solidify this in your own head, you can, because the terms just are a bit weird. So just as a quick little 40-second review, if you want to assess any input you're having with a dog and you want to try to categorize that in this framework, all you have to do is ask yourself 2 questions. Am I adding something in the interaction, or am I taking something away? And the second question is, am I trying to encourage more of a behavior or dissuade less of a behavior? If you can answer both of those questions, then you can just have those pairs of words together and you can identify that pretty accurately, right? If I'm adding something, positive. If I'm taking something away, negative. If I'm encouraging a behavior to happen more, reinforcement. If I'm discouraging or dissuading a behavior to happen less, punishment. And so you can kind of do that. The other way to do that, if you are taking a psych class and you're wanting to remember something, if you have terms like this, you have a 4-quadrant, 4 labels, little memory suggestion I would have to you is just picture something. Have something that kind of pops into your memory when that label shows up. So if you have positive reinforcement show up, just picture a bag of treats. If positive punishment is the question, picture a big prong collar. That correction in dog training, positive punishment. If you have negative reinforcement as the label that you're trying to remember what that means, just picture an alarm clock with negative reinforcement. That alarm sound goes off, you want to take that away, and you're trying to encourage the getting up on time. For negative punishment, just picture a whining teenager who's just gotten their phone taken away, or the kid in the timeout, right? You're taking something away to dissuade behavior as a punishment. So if you picture those things, when those labels pop up, you'll be able to remember that. Or if you really want to kind of analyze it, you can just ask those 2 questions. Am I adding or taking something away? Am I trying to encourage more of a behavior or dissuade less of a behavior? So there you go. That's your primer on conditioning and Skinner and the 4 quadrants. If you haven't been completely overloaded with geekiness, you can continue on to part 2 of this. I guess we'll call it a mini course on conditioning and Skinner and the 4 quadrants. And in podcast 74 and kind of part 2 of this, we'll move on with this setup that we have so far, and we'll talk about kind of application. I'll talk a little bit about my rationale for why I use all 4 quadrants, and then kind of a little bit of a rebuttal to kind of some dog training philosophies out there that just sort of reject parts of these 4 quadrants and just don't use some of it, and advocate that people do not use some of it. And I'll kind of within that, I'll tell you why I do opt to use all 4 quadrants. And then we'll go quadrant by quadrant, and I'll describe some of the mistakes I see in technique application as people go through some behavioral modification strategies in each of these quadrants, and some of the things, kind of the pitfalls and things to watch out for as you're applying techniques in each of those quadrants to make it more effective for you. So there you go. Thanks for hanging out with me. And until I talk to you in podcast 74, go have some fun explaining Skinner's 4 quadrants to your dog. I'll talk to you next time.